Welcome, everyone. My name's Mark Dannenfelser. I'm a program coordinator for Contemplative Outreach, and I'm so delighted to be here. I'm delighted that all of you are here. I'm just having a grand time scrolling through and seeing in the chat box where everybody is from, and even better, and scrolling through and seeing all the beautiful faces here as we gather. And so I just I'm going to say a few words, but I really want to start with just inviting you to just settle in and really arrive here. I know some of us are still arriving, but I really think that today we have a special offering for you, and that is, I think, going to be very informative, but also inspiring as we reflect on the contemplative tradition and also the practice of centering prayer. And we get to experience centering prayer together as community. And so I'm really just happy about that. In a minute or so, I'll happily introduce you to Carmen, and then we'll have a period of centering prayer together. And then Carmen will share about her, I think, very important work that she's doing, translating some of these deep and profound and rich texts from the Christian tradition. So Carmen will present for a little while after a period of centering prayer, and then we'll have time for you to ask questions or make comments that Carmen will respond to. And so a little bit of a housekeeping point. We're going to close down the chat box for now, and it'll be mostly closed throughout so that we can all practice doing one thing at one time. And then we'll open it up again during the Q&R period. So you'll have a chance to ask a question out loud, but if you prefer to just chat a question, you'll be able to do that in the chat box. If you're having any difficulty, you can chat to us directly, even though it won't be out to the whole group, and let us know that you're having trouble with something. And we have a tech team here that will support you. Chris Thompson, I want to not forget to thank him. He'll be behind the scenes supporting us, and he can pretty much fix anything. So just let us know if you're having any difficulties. You're not able to unmute now. That's by design. We'll also give you the opportunity to unmute later on when we get to the Q&R. So let's get to it. I'm anxious to introduce you to Carmen. Carmen Acevedo Butcher is an internationally acclaimed speaker, author, teacher, poet, and translator of spiritual texts. Her dynamic work in spirituality and the power of language has garnered interest from various media, including the BBC and NPR's Morning Edition. From a young age, she immersed herself in the presence prayer and has practiced contemplative prayer for decades. Carmen is the award-winning translator of classics such as Practice of the Presence by Brother Lawrence, The Cloud of Unknowing by Anonymous, and Hildegard of Bingen, a Spiritual Reader, among other texts. She was the Carnegie Foundation Professor of the Year and a Fulbright Senior Lecturer in Seoul, and currently teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, in the College of Writing programs. In addition to all these skills and accomplishments and acolytes, I have, in just getting to know her a bit, come to see her also as this beautiful artist who looks for the beauty in life, who leads with her heart, who is enormously curious, kind-hearted, and open to the wonder of life. And so I'm delighted to introduce you to my new friend and kindred spirit, Carmen Acevedo Butcher. Hi, Carmen.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for having me here. I'm so happy to be with you all. And I do want to say, Mark and I have had a lot of really good conversations before this. And so one of the best parts is community. So thank you all. I think we're all seasoned beginners, as James Finley says, so I'm glad to be with you. We are going to start with the most important part, really, which is the centering prayer. And I know that you all have done this, most likely, but we're just gonna, if you're like me, I like to be reminded very gently of what it is. I need reminders of the basics. So it's all about intention. If we have the intention to rest in love and the divine sacredness, then we're there. And so we center ourselves in thinking about that. And we remember that where silence meets presence, as Thomas Keating often said, there we have contemplation. So it's a very ordinary thing, really. And it gives us a chance to let go of thoughts and images, and even, if you're comfortable doing this, a felt sense of I am here. So just letting go. And Cynthia Bourgeault, my dear friend and one of my heroes in spiritual seeking, talks about if you catch yourself thinking, you let the thought go. So it's wonderful after all the grasping that we do. I know that I do, that it's wonderful to practice for 15 or 20 minutes this letting go. When the thoughts come in, we let them go. And I remember the first time in the Conyers Monastery in Georgia, hearing Cynthia tell the story of Thomas Keating's, when the woman came to him at one of the workshops and said, "Oh, I'm a failure at this. I've had 10,000 thoughts in 20 minutes. And he sort of clapped his hands and said, "Wonderful, 10,000 chances to return to love, to return to God." So we remember that thoughts will come, and this is how it is. We don't judge them. We just let them come and let them go. And that the sacred word is useful. I know one difference between centering prayer and the cloud of unknowing teacher, and it's a very small difference in a way, is that he says, pick a sacred word of one syllable. And of course, with centering prayer, it's like 1 or 2 or 3 syllables, could be a short phrase, maybe a sacred glance or breath, or even sometimes people have told me they have a sacred image. And we know it doesn't function as a mantra, but as a reminder of our intention to sit in the presence of love. So it comes, we put it into our unconscious and it comes out to help us do this, like a friend, really. I think of the sacred word as a friend, and it can be really anything that helps you. And then freedom of posture. I know Mark shared with me a really wonderful book by Mr. Trelevin recently. And one of the things I love to emphasize when I lead workshops is sit however you like. Sometimes people need to lie down even, and you can, of course, close your eyes if that helps you, or maybe soften your gaze or lower it. We're going to have on the next slide, which Chris is helping us with, that will just be the marsh. So I have some photos throughout this slide deck of the marsh where I go and where I really also meditate through walking meditation. I'm going to ring the bell, but I will say that also sometimes I sing myself into meditation, and I have been given permission by Paulette Meyer and also Gerard Guiton, who wrote the lyrics. And Paulette, my friend, did the music and also sings it, but I've been given permission to sing Stillness, which is a beautiful Quaker chant. So I'm going to sing it. You can also find it on my YouTube channel. I'm going to sing it once and then ring the bell, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of centering prayer. Stillness, deep, deep within us. From small beginnings it flows into the living water, the ocean of God. Through our stillness, God moves. Thank you all again for your presence here. I remember Clifton Walters saying that if you can sit and do nothing, you can do anything. And I know any sitting, any session is a successful one, but that one was especially juicy. And I think it was being in your presence. Although when I meditate or contemplate alone, I try to think of all the ancestors who've done it, all the people doing it presently. So I'm very excited to be with the Contemplative Outreach International community. Y'all are very encouraging in the way you are spiritual seekers. And again, I want to thank Mark for the invitation and the conversations, and also Chris for being behind the scenes, holding everything together so intelligently. So Chris, could we go to the next slide, please? So Mary Oliver is my patron saint or patroness saint of everything. And so one of the things we're going to do, one of the things I hope will happen today is that this will be meditative for you, our being together. Even looking at these slides, I hope they'll be meditative. I take photos of like these lilies of the valley in front of our house and pause for a moment, and that's meditation, right? I mean, they're so small and so beautiful. And I love how Mary Oliver talks about interconnectedness and what is contemplation. Seems all of her poetry helps us see that it's living from interconnectedness with self and others. And I love her quote. It was in Parabola this spring. Do you think there is anything not attached by its unbreakable cord to everything else? So that's just so beautiful. Chris, could we go to the next one, please? And I also think of Richard Rohr, who is always pointing us to the sacred in ordinary matter. And I'm not going to read all the slides to you. I know you can, you're brilliant people. But one of the things I want to highlight from what Richard Rohr says is it's not about becoming spiritual beings nearly as much as about becoming human beings. I absolutely love that. And Mirabai Starr, another one of my friends and heroes, says this is becoming an everyday mystic, so open to anyone and all of us. And this again is the marsh near us. I should add that near the marsh is a wastewater treatment plant, and next to it is our train tracks. So everything remains real and interconnected, right? So next slide, please. So I want to ask you, how did you come to contemplation? How did you come? I think reflecting on that at some point at length is such a useful thing to do, such a self-honoring thing to do, the sacredness within each one of us. For me, I was very young, and I've come to realize really most recently after translating Brother Lawrence that it is highlighted for me how contemplation is a gift. And my friend Jim Finley says we can, set up situations and we can give ourselves incentives and make spaces for ourselves to contemplate so that God can be present with us. We can realize that God is already present with us, but it's always a gift. So I love remembering that when I was young, I was born with a hole in my heart. So I spent lots of time in hospitals, and this was a very early wake-up call to mortality. So I wasn't that little kid who thought I'm going to live forever. I was a little kid who thought, wow, I reached 16, and here I am now 100. But I also was taken to childhood churches where really one of the things that I learned was that I was bad. Of course, that was misinformation, but it was quite an influence on me. So one of the things that I've been very grateful for as I've grown up is realizing the sacredness in me and in others and in the earth, and coming back to what Matthew Fox calls the original blessing. What a joy, really wonderful. And I had undiagnosed dyslexia because in the 60s, that just wasn't something we talked about in the rural areas where I grew up, and also experienced childhood trauma. And so this sent me out of doors a lot. One reason that I love Mary Oliver is that she says, nature saved me, and it did me also. And as a teenager, I took really long walks in nature. The red-tailed hawk became one of my best friends. You know, I always knew where they lived and such. And to this day, going out into the marsh, I have the snowy white egrets. And but I did grow up watching tadpoles in creeks in like Alabama and places like that, and watching their transformation. So nature has been one of my greatest teachers. And very young, I had a very sincere desire to want to know God. And it was mostly because I heard a preacher once say in church something about, you know, the Bible verse of praying without ceasing. And that just grabbed my attention. I thought, I want that. It just sounded so, I don't know, I can't even tell you. It was beyond my understanding because I was just a kid. And it would be years before I kind of understood what this was. And I'm not sure I understand today, but at least I've experienced some of it, right? But I also had a sharp awareness of how painfully untamed my mind was, because I remember my mother would come in and say, "Oh, you can't sleep, sweetie." I'm like, "No." And she'd say, "Oh, you just need to wipe your mind clean like it's a blackboard." You know, back in the day, we had chalk and blackboards. Just wipe your mind clean. So I was like, well, that sounds kind of simplistic. My mother loves me very much, but so I would wipe my mind clean, and then I would watch it was empty for just a nanosecond, and then I'd think I watched my hand take up the eraser and wipe my mind clean, and then I analyzed the eraser, and then I analyzed the chalk dust, and you know, it was thoughts, the monkey mind. I do love that sincerity saves us, really. And Ira Progoff, who, as you know, translated The Cloud, and I've read everything he's ever written. He's, you know, such a wonderful depth psychologist, and he studied with Jung and wrote his dissertation on Jung. And he says Anonymous just has one requirement for anyone wanting to contemplate, and that is sincerity. So if our sincerity doesn't quite match where we are, where we want to be yet, it's okay. I love this about these teachers. They're so encouraging. And, you know, The Cloud Anonymous says God doesn't look at where we are as much as where we want to be. So I love that sincerity counts for a lot. And Brother Lawrence says the same thing. Now, I want to add really quickly that Brother Lawrence and The Clouds Anonymous, in my mind, if I walked into a tea shop, I would have no problem after just a few words with them figuring out who was who. I mean, obviously, one has, you know, French is French and the other one's from England, but just the way their personalities are, because The Clouds Anonymous is very sort of spicy, as we might say, in a very sweet way. He's like that teacher you love, who's kind of crusty on the outside and just a marshmallow on the inside. And Brother Lawrence can also speak very plainly, but he's a very calm, more quiet type of soul. But he says, they say very, very much the same things, even in their different personality ways. Brother Lawrence told Joseph, who is a priest about 20 years his younger, Joseph of Beaufort, who wanted to come see him, kind of like Brother Lawrence was his starets, you know, his spiritual, you know, guru to him. And Brother Lawrence said to Joseph, if your sincere intention is to know the love of God, you can ask to see me whenever you want without fear of bothering me. You won't be bothering me, in other words. But if not, if you're not sincere, he told Joseph, you shouldn't come at all. So I kind of love that. And the friar says, start where you are. So what I also love is that we can just start in the middle of our fears, our weakness, our wounds, our harms to ourselves and others, and that these are the raw material. I know Pema Chodron talks about this a lot. And Paula Darcy says also, God comes to you disguised as your life. And I always take great comfort in that, because there are always parts of our lives that I imagine, at least if I could choose, I would say, I don't want this. And that is the path. So I love the fact that union with God is the hope for both of these, the yearning, not as God is thought of or as God is imagined to be, but as God actually is in their very nature, love. So it's that wonderful mystery that's available in ordinary matter. So next slide, please, Chris. And contemplation, is it simply returning to love? I would say yes. So the down to earth prayer practices. So if you go online and watch a lot of William Meninger's different videos, he talks about discovering the cloud of unknowing in the library, and he was in love with the language of it, the Middle English of it. That's why he picked it up at first. And then he was reading it going, oh, wow, there are like things I could teach here, like tools for prayer, like things you can do. Like it's not like just for one or two people, a couple of elite people who somehow have some special sauce to be contemplatives. It's for everyone. And he said I could teach it. So they're down to earth prayer practices and wise spiritual experimentation that both Anonymous and Brother Lawrence help us with. And what I love about it is that it does bring about certain things, recognizing the divine's kindness, that everything we want is right here, right now, that we can grow in self-compassion and heal, that we can develop a beyond dualism mindset and cultivate patience. So for the first one or the second one, growing in self-compassion, I always like to think about, and I know Father Thomas Keating talked about this, and I think of it with gratitude that bringing in a spiritual director, a spiritual companion, or a therapist can really help support the practice. It has me. I know Father Thomas talks about how contemplative prayer brings up many things from our shadow selves, from the unconscious, and it can really be a help. And sometimes a necessity to have someone alongside us helping us. And then I like to think about patience because I often think of my friends from years ago laughing at me talking about patience. And I even, chuckle myself because I'm not naturally a patient person. I love thinking of Gregory, who said, all holy desires grow when postponed. And the desire that diminishes with delay was never a holy desire. It's very comforting. Another mystic, I forget which one it was, but one of the women mystics, medieval women mystics, says, God sometimes delays and is always right on time. So I love remembering that. And then listening actively to and loving others, strengthening healthy community, which is what Barbara A. Holmes, Reverend Dr. Barbara A. Holmes, talks about, how contemplation is community. And so we can contribute to the common good and do small things with great love. So I'm very thankful for that. Next slide, please, Chris. So even your desire to pray is praying. And I think that sometimes I'm most encouraged by this truth, that even my desire to pray is praying. So I can cut myself some slack. And that contemplation is easy is something that both the Cloud author, Anonymous, and Brother Lawrence teach us. Next slide, please, Chris. The other thing is, I think, at least when I was younger, I used to think that there was a certain way I needed to pray. It's very much from maybe my schooling days of always trying to figure out what the teacher wanted. But I love being reminded that I can pray the way I can and not the way I can't. And that changes all the time. And that contemplation is simply a gentle returning. Next slide, please, Chris. So Anonymous says this, and also Father William Meninger liked to quote it a lot. Some people believe contemplation is time consuming. I did when I first started doing centering prayer decades ago. I was like, I just don't have time for this. But it's not, he says. In fact, it takes less time than anything else you'll ever do. It's as brief as an atom. I was shocked when I read atom in the original. I thought the 20th century, places like Georgia Tech, and other places had the skinny on Adam, but no, Anonymous talks about it. And Brother Lawrence says something similar. He says, we must stop for a brief moment as often as we can to love God deep in our heart, to savor them, even though this is brief and in secret. So it doesn't take long. And isn't the marsh beautiful? Next slide, please, Chris. This is a spider web in the marsh early one morning. And then I love, this is also something that Reverend Dr. Barbara A. Holmes emphasizes, the unspeakable joy of contemplation that really helps us through difficult times and also wakens us up to the joy inherent in life, the gifts of life. So Anonymous says, do the work of contemplation until you feel the delight of it. In the trying is the desire. So I love that. So like if we try to do it, it catches. And then, as is often said, it becomes the prayer that prays itself. Kind of like when you see the birds early in the morning and they're going up to the thermals and then they reach the thermals and they don't flap as often. They just flap occasionally. And sometimes they don't flap at all for a long time. You're just like, surely they would fall from the sky, but they don't. They're just up in the thermals after flapping to get there. And Brother Lawrence says, in the beginning, we must act faithfully and renounce ourselves, but after that, we experience only unspeakable joy. Now, I love this. He says, when we face difficulties, we only need to return to Jesus and ask him for his kind help, making everything easy. And one of the things I hope at the end of our time together today is that these two teachers seem more down to earth, real to you. So Brother Lawrence had, when he entered the monastery at the age of 26, after much failure, until he was 36, he had a dark night of the soul. He prayed the presence prayer for 10 years with no visible results. He returned to love, and he still felt that he was stressed all the time. He felt that he was damned to hell. And of course, he was in great pain, but he kept at it. So next slide, please, Chris. I love also being reminded that contemplation is essential for all spiritual seekers. So Augustine starts us out with that in the Christian tradition, when he was with his mother Monica in Ostia. And in a brief awareness, we touch the eternal wisdom that lives in everything. So they had a moment of timelessness in their conversation. And then Andrew Harvey translates in the Bhagavad Gita, still your mind in me. Those who contemplate the unmanifested beyond the reach of thought and of feeling will come unto me, who is love. So I love thinking that people all over the world are in this sphere of love and returning to love. Next slide, please, Chris. And I also want you to see that contemplation is written on vellum. So when you read The Cloud of Unknowing, and I highly encourage you to go look at it in the Gallagher edition, it's free online. When you read it in the Middle English, it is actually a contemplative experience because of the way it's written. The same is true for Brother Lawrence in the French. But here we see two of the earliest manuscripts of The Cloud. Now, this is interesting because the one on the left is reliable more, and the one on the right, the scribe took liberties, added things he thought would be really nice, but that were, not really accurate to the original manuscript. So when I look at this, and I know that it was written in vellum, and I know it was written with homemade ink, oak gall ink, made from the sort of knots on oak trees. And I think this is a very embodied human endeavor. I think about how a book of the size of Cloud of Unknowing would have taken about a flock of sheep. I know that's sad to think about, but it would have taken an entire flock, and also it would have been back in the day very expensive. And it took a long time to write down. They also had, as you see here, other colors like blue and red and such. I'm really thankful for Dr. Phyllis Hodgson because she produced the first edition of The Cloud of Unknowing, and it came out. Of course, there was a lot of time before that she was working on it, but it came out during World War II. Isn't that something? And she crafted it from 17 existing manuscripts. And if you're like me, you wish there were an original, but what she put together is as good as we're going to get, and is really good because she did a hard job. I really am grateful for Dr. Hodgson's work. She put together as near as possible what the original would have been, and she made my translation possible. And these are from the British Museum. Sometimes when you go there, you can see them if you want. The next slide, please. And then we're to the cloud's opening prayer. And behind it you see is the Middle English and the cloud. And it goes like this. God, to you all hearts are open. To you all longings speak. And to you no secret thing is hidden. I beg you, purify the intentions of my heart through the unspeakable gift of your grace, so I can love you with all I am and praise you for all you are. Amen. And I'm going to sing this, so I'm going to change my audio setting just for a minute. So next slide, please, Chris. So here you can see it, because I kind of wanted you to see the handwriting. Isn't that beautiful handwriting? I would be hard pressed to do that myself, right? And you can see at the top, it says, here beginneth the prayer on the prologue. And on the left is the Middle English, and on the right is my translation. If you look on the left, you see one word underlined in blue, and it's GCE, and above it is an A, although it looks like a U. Do you see that? And that's the word grace, which in the Middle English is grasa, which I really love because it kind of sounds like you're saying grass, doesn't it? And I think that if you think of the Viriditas of Hildegard and the grass and the way it smells sometimes, it all seems very of a piece to me. And I'm going to sing this because I have spent a lot of time meditating on this and singing it as part of meditation. And you can kind of follow along because you see God over here on the left is the big G in blue. And then the O has a little red in the middle and a D. And then you see unto. And I'll give you a really fun story. When I was translating this in 2008, my daughter was like 12 or so, and she came up behind me. And, the cloud is, I would say, not easy to translate because it's pretty complex in some ways, and you want to be faithful to the text. But she would come up behind me and she'd see God and she'd see unto and whom, and she'd be, why is it taking you so long? I could have this done already. And I used to think, yeah, there is that aspect to it. There are a lot of cognates and everything. So hopefully you can kind of follow along a little bit. God, unto whom malahertus ben opan, and unto whom alawilla speketh, and unto whom no private thing is hid. He besageth they so for to cleanse the intent of mine head with the unspeakable gift of the grasa. Thought he may parfit lich loveth they, and worthy lich praiseth they. Amen. One reason I love singing this, and I heard Matthew Fox talk about this once, he said that Hildegard of Bingen's chants were very much like you are, doing breath work, like meditation, because of the breathing involved. And one of the reasons I love singing this opening prayer is how much it focuses on these beautiful words and these beautiful ideas, and how it also brings me into breath work. It's very calming. All right, next slide, please, Chris. So I started thinking, as I started to be asked more and more to talk about, the cloud and Brother Lawrence and such, why are they so similar in my mind? And so I had to go investigate. So we have the 14th century Anonymous, and we're going to get to that. But one of the things to look at to get to that is his contemplation basics of 321. So the first one that often is skipped over is the Lectio Divina that he reminds people to do in chapter 35. He assumes that a contemplative has a Lectio Divina foundation, and that would be these three activities, right? Of reading, reflecting, and praying. So for Brother Lawrence, that would be he heard the Discalced Carmelite co-founders, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, Juan de la Cruz. During the refectory, he also read the gospel. Today, this could be, Mary Oliver also, in addition to scripture and other kinds of sacred readings or readings that you find sacred. And then we have anonymous and two clouds. So we have these three activities and then two clouds. He says the first time you practice contemplation, you'll only experience a darkness, like a cloud of unknowing. You won't know what this is. It will always be between you and your God, whatever you do. And I love this. So be sure you make your home in this darkness. Stay there as long as you can, crying out to him over and over again because you love him. It's the closest you can get to God here on earth, by waiting in this darkness and in this cloud. And we should pause here to talk a minute about this darkness. I was listening to an interview by Sister Julia Walsh with Padraig Ó Tuama, and he was talking about this darkness, how we often in our minds have this binary of darkness is bad and light is good. And I love about the mystics is they complicate this and go beyond this binary, so that unknowing and darkness are these beautiful aspects of love, really, and that really do go beyond words. And then he says, to the cloud of unknowing above you and between you and your God, add the cloud of forgetting beneath you, between you and creation. You must forget everything. Work at this diligently as I've asked you to, and I know God's mercy will lead you there. One of the interesting things behind the scenes is if I'm asked to do like a workshop like this, and then we do centering prayer at the beginning, one of the joys is the 10,000 thoughts I have of what I hope to remember to do now that I've met you all and we're in place during the actual workshop. And so then I have to take my sacred word and let it go, right? Because this is just human nature. So I love this, that we have these two clouds, the cloud of unknowing, which also kind of goes against everything we're taught. Because, to get through school, to get through our jobs, it's what we know often. And so this cloud of unknowing is very wonderfully countercultural, isn't it? And then the cloud of forgetting. And then we have anonymous and the one sacred word. So we have 3, 2, 1. And he says, select a little word of one syllable, not two. This is his spiciness. The shorter the word, the more it helps the work of the Spirit. God or love works well. Pick one of these or any other word you like, as long as it is one syllable, fasten it to your heart. And that's where Cynthia Bourgeault says, put it into your unconscious and it comes out when you need to let go of a thought. So he also says somewhere else, and so you can hear his words in the Middle English. First, I'll read it in the modern English. He says, this simple prayer, meaning this one word, gets God's attention more quickly than any long psalm mumbled mindlessly through closed teeth. That's why the scriptures say a short prayer penetrates heaven. And in the Middle English, I love this. And rather it pierces, and rather it pierceth the ears of Allmächtig God, the ears, the ears of Allmächtig God, than doth any longer sauter und minfully mumled in the teeth. And therefore it is written that short prayer pierceth heaven, that short prayer pierces heaven. I absolutely love that. Next slide, please, Chris. So contemplation became centering prayer is a wonderful transformation to study all on its own. I love the fact that other possible names were discussed, like contemplative prayer according to the cloud, which is what William Miniger always preferred, although he gave in very, gently to centering prayer as a term. Although he does call it in one place, he thought it was a little bit, and he laughs when he says it, a little bit gimmicky. And then also the prayer of the cloud was talked about as a possibility, but then that just sounded too, I think, vague, kind of abstract. And so Basil Pennington gives us a little insight in one of the interviews of Thomas Keating and Basil Pennington and William Miniger. And he says Merton taught a lot about this prayer. And he would say things like, if you really want to come to God, you go to your own center and pass through that center into the very center of God. And so centering prayer. When I think about how John of the Cross talks about go deep into your center, and how Brother Lawrence does also, I think centering prayer works. Next slide, please. So I like to remember the diverse ancestors of centering prayer, and I like to include the women. So of course we have Thomas Keating, and then we have Mary Mrzowski and William Miniger and so many others. Hindu transcendental meditation, Zen meditation, Jewish meditation, Jesus, Mary Magdalene, John, Paul, Lectio Divina, the Desert Ammas and Abbas, the Black Church contemplative tradition, Benedict Augustine, all of the Christian church mothers and fathers, and then Denis, our key figure, also called Dionysius the Areopagite, and Guido II, who talks a lot about Lectio Divina, and then the Cloud, Teresa, Juan, and then Brother Lawrence. And I like to talk about his prayer, his practice of the presence prayer as being sort of centering prayer to go in some ways. I'm grateful for these ancestors. Chris, please, the next slide. So here we have a little heart and the marsh in the background. Yes, centering prayer is a gently letting go of attention to our thoughts, a lifting up the heart in love to God, a returning to love, opening to divine reality itself, seeing in the dark, resting in a naked intention, choosing and using a sacred word to release a thought, practicing an intention that transforms our attention and its calmness and joy. So all these things. Next slide, please. This, I think, is worth thinking about a lot. This is one of the formative thoughts for me forever. If you catch yourself thinking, you let the thought go. That is a powerful, powerful, powerful mechanism. Next slide, please. And then Thomas Gallus of Vercelli was about a century before Anonymous. And I also like to remember that the Clouds Anonymous was, Chaucer was alive then. But Thomas Gallus says the highest cognitive faculty is not the intellect, but love. So this is the area we're moving into, right? The wordlessness of love. Chris, next slide, please. Contemplation is community. I like to bring it up several times. These are some thoughts that Julia Bolton Holloway has raised as possibilities. I don't think we'll ever be able to prove it, but isn't it interesting to consider? This could have been true. Was the Clouds Anonymous friends with Julianne of Norwich? Was Anonymous perhaps Julianne's spiritual director companion? And could the Cloud have been written for Julianne, who was born in 1343? So look how close they were. So the Cloud author lived up where the cloud is, and Julianne where you see the hazelnut. And we do know that there were a lot of sharings of letters and different teachings, that contemplation has always been taught in community. We'll never know, but I like thinking about it. Next slide, please, Chris. So we're going to switch to another country. 250 years later, we crossed the English Channel from England to France. And now we're with Brother Lawrence. And he was born as Nicolas Herman, or Nicholas Herman, which can get confusing since his surname looks like a first name to us. He was born into the lowest level of society, and that lowest level of society comprised about 98% of society. So that's a devastating statistic. It was called the Third Estate, and he was born in tiny Ermenil. It was just a territory. It wasn't even part of France yet. You can see it in the top right there in the Northeast. He became a disabled war veteran when at around age 18, he joined the 30 Years' War. He would have done that because he would not have been marked for an education, and he also would not have been able to have gotten a scholarship to go to school. He just would not have been educated. He was part of the 98%. And so going into the Army would have given him a stipend, something to do. He would have delivered lots of messages. We don't know what else. He would have marched a lot mindlessly. And then he did become a prisoner of war. He was, we don't know if he was tortured, but he was questioned as a spy. He was very brave. Brother Lawrence, we hear from Joseph, and then he was let go. So in a battle, he was injured in his leg, and for 50 plus years, he would limp pretty pronounced, in a very pronounced way, and was in pain every day. So every step he took was painful. The last years of his life, he couldn't walk at all. So at first, decided when he quit the Army and he went into the valet business. He was a footman for a nobleman in Paris, and he said he failed miserably at it. He was a, quote, clumsy oaf. Then he became a hermit, but as Joseph says, he was a bit not ready for that yet. His emotions were, it sounds to me when you look at his words that he was having some post-traumatic stress disorder. At least it sounds like he was in great emotional distress. And then he had an uncle who was a Discalced Carmelite lay brother, so he went into that eventually. Now, when he was 18, he had a mystical experience in front of a tree at winter that had lost its leaf. All of a sudden, he was looking at it and he just felt peace and love. But as we all know, he had to work that out. He said he never lost that feeling of the divine being loving and peace and all, but that he had a lot to work out, and he had a lot of failures, which endears him to me a lot. So we noticed that both of them, Brother Lawrence and the Clouds Anonymous, were immersed in the same contemplative tradition. They had deep experiential knowledge of contemplation. I mean, they could not have written about it the way they did. I mean, they really did the contemplative deeds over and over. And they both authored a spiritual classic, just a few centuries apart. Next slide, please, Chris. And here we have Brother Lawrence's book. This is from 1692. You can see it at the bottom under Paris. It says MDCXC II. So he didn't publish anything in his lifetime, Brother Lawrence. He didn't have an Instagram account. He had a life of hiddenness on purpose. But when he died, all of his friends were like, are there any more letters of his we can read? Because they really help us. So Joseph, his friend, the priest, went looking and found some more letters, 16 in all. But when we look at Francois Fenelon, one of the archbishops of the time and also a supporter of Brother Lawrence, he had hundreds of letters. So Brother Lawrence, to the end, was not the privileged person. We only have 16 letters of his. My edition publishes all of them. Sometimes you can find editions that, they're not all there. All of his writings aren't there. But one of the things I did do was give a wide-ranging audience all of Brother Lawrence for the first time. And I translated from his books that you see here. They're in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and they're free. Yes, this is like, I'm grateful for the rest of my life to the National Library of France that they make these free. So next slide, please, Chris. So what is Brother Lawrence's presence prayer? Well, I call it centering prayer or the cloud of unknowing prayer to go for a reason. He says, in the middle of your task, you can comfort yourself with love as often as you can. And during meals and conversations, lift up your heart to God. Sometimes the slightest little awareness will always be very pleasant. So in this way, it's a returning to love. I mean, sure, you could use a sacred word, but it's not really that, but it's a returning to love. And Brother Lawrence says that you'd be surprised what people say in these small, brief, mini, M-I-N-I conversations with love throughout the day. Sometimes we're grateful because that was a big part of his prayer. Sometimes we're just saying help. I often do that before I go in to teach a class or in between, like, what do I need to do to help these students do well, to connect. But also, I think he was praying things like, because he did not like kitchen work, he says he had an aversion to it. That's the word, aversion. And I think in the beginning, he was saying, how do I make soup? Can you help me as I stir this soup? I don't like kitchen work. And he was cooking not for 2 or 3, but for 100 or so brothers. And he ended up to where he did it with great love. He came to have a peace about it. And people noticed this about him. They said he could have several people talking to him and needing several things from him at once. And he was calmness in the middle of it. And I can say that I started translating Brother Lawrence the summer of when the pandemic picked up in earnest. I was also teaching full time, and I had students online whose parents were essential workers and were dying. And so there was a lot of death, and I was translating and thinking, what is the point of this book for today? And one of the things that it meant for me was whenever I got up at 4 to go translate, there was great calmness. Brother Lawrence is a conduit of juicy calmness. He's the real deal. And so it was very encouraging to meet with him and to get into his words and to experience that calmness firsthand, which is what I prayed that this translation would do. Next slide, please, Chris. And so the shared influence, here's a snippet of the text that both Brother Lawrence and the Cloud of Unknowing have in common. It's from Dennis. Trinity, lead us up beyond knowing and light to the mysteries of the loving word, which are simple, whole, and unchanging, veiled in the beyond bright cloud of a hidden silence and in the brilliant darkness. You shine, filling to overflowing our unseeing minds. So there's the unknowing, the unseeing, the brilliant or dazzling darkness. And that's from the 5th or 6th century. Next slide, please, Chris. And so you can look at this. His influence on both of them is love-centered theology and letting go. The divine nature as ecstasy, or as like Cynthia Bourgeot often says, this love that seeks us out and wants intimacy with us. So like Brother Lawrence says, if you forget to practice the presence, when you do remember, return again to returning to love. What I love about it is it's kind of unlike, you know, when I was growing up, if you missed the Wednesday night or the Sunday morning or the Sunday evening service, somebody might call you up and say, where were you? I know they meant well. But when you forget the practice of the presence, my experience is when I return and go, hey, I'm back, it's like love is saying, great, you're back. Or it's just like, oh, good. You know, and Brother Lawrence also says, why would we want to leave love alone? You know, it's fun to hang out with love. So this returning to love, it's not like a thing of like, did I get an A? It's more like a fun thing and a relationship. So we experience the divine as making itself, that's how Dennis puts it, itself vulnerable to us. That's his pronoun he uses. And that we worship the divine as the moving, unifying power of creation and practice this unification through unknowing with love. And that we see every being as sacred and as directly, immediately dependent on God. And that we enter into a journey about perfecting. And perfecting has nothing to do with flawlessness here. Literally means redoing contemplation and growing in love. To become, as Brother Lawrence says, the wisest, quote, the wisest lovers of God. So the fancy theological term is affective apophaticism, but it really is just that we cannot describe the mystery of love, that it's a not saying. Now, Dennis had a lot of people he influenced, and some of these are Gregory the Great, who said love is knowledge. Thomas Aquinas, who quoted him hundreds, if not thousands of times. Gothic cathedrals were inspired by him, Meister Eckhart, and Jacques Derrida. Who would have thought? Next slide, please, Chris. And so here you kind of see the spiral. I just love spirals. It starts with the source in the middle, and we kind of see our ancestors here. And you can go through it, and you see Teresa at the top left and John. And that's where Brother Lawrence heard about Dennis, was from them. Of course, the Cloud author would have read him directly. And then we come up to today, and there you all are at the mouth of the spiral, the Contemplative Outreach International Community, and you and all of us within love. Next slide, please. Chris. Now, one of the things, it's hard sometimes to tell the difference between the two because they're cut from the same cloth. And they sound a lot like Richard Rohr when he says it's that hard and that easy, contemplation. Yes, in the beginning, this prayer seems demanding when you're not used to it, but stick with it and it becomes restful and easy. That could be Brother Lawrence, but it's the cloud. Anonymous. And then Brother Lawrence says below, yeah, it's a little difficult at first, but it achieves marvelous effects. And when done faithfully, so like flossing your teeth, right? When done faithfully, it imperceptibly leads the soul to this simple awareness. So one reason I think we kind of have a hard time with it at first is because we're used to direct results. Like I wash the dishes, they're washed. I do contemplative prayer, what happened? So it takes a while to trust the process. And then he says, this is the most sacred, the most robust, the easiest, most effective form of prayer. That's Brother Lawrence. Next slide, please. I love that contemplation is beyond dogma, and we're almost done. So this is a rose near my house, and they both avoid dogmatic and stentorian tones in their teaching. There's no yelling. They share what worked for them and suggest what to try, and then advise to try things and see what works best for you. I love that. I mean, I have like neurodivergence of how I learn to read and, all that kind of stuff. And as a teacher, all students have different ways of learning. Every rose unfolds in its own way is my thinking. Anonymous says in chapter 32, here's another trick you could try on how to handle your thoughts. And another place he says, this, worked for me, try it. If it works for you, great. If not, try something else. And Brother Lawrence says that you can try these different phrases like, my God, I am all yours, and these others. And then he adds, or any other phrases love produces on the spot. So neither one of them is making a method that you should follow 1 to 20. And Ira Progoff explores this in The Practice of Process Meditation from 1980. He talks about how Anonymous counsels an empirical approach. So it's very much William Jamesish of spiritual experience. Try it and, use what works for you prayerfully. And next slide, please. And then we have the same ocean and different shorelines. So I was going to ask you if you can guess who said this first one. Why does this short little prayer of one small syllable, I guess you know now, right? Why does it penetrate heaven? Because you pray it with all that you are and all that you can be, and it expresses an inclusive, wide-reaching love, making you care for others and wish them everything you wish for yourself. Isn't that very Buddhist also, in the sense of may you be well, may others be well? It's very Tonglen and metta. So Chris, do you mind to show us who that is? I think it should come up. Yep, it's the cloud. So the next one is, thank you, Chris, you're great. A brief lifting up of the heart is enough, a brief awareness of God, an inner act of affection. These prayers, however short, are very pleasing to God, little by little. So be patient. Get used to this simple but sacred practice. And Chris, if you could show us who that is. Didn't come up, but it's supposed to be a little sandal. So that's Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence, don't they sound similar though? It is not the next one, who you are or what you've been that God sees with his merciful eyes, but what you want to be. So God is really love. And who is that, Chris? Is it going to work? Good. It's the cloud. And the last one, I imagine you can guess. Everything is possible for those who believe, even more for those who hope, still more for those who love, and most of all for all those who practice and persevere in these 3 powerful paths. And that's Brother Lawrence again. My favorite quote, if I had to pick, of Brother Lawrence's is, the less reasons there appeared to be hopeful, the more he hoped. So I think that's down to his practice. So next slide, please, Chris, I think. And this is the last. God does not ask much of us, merely a brief thought, a little love. We don't need to shout out to do this. God is closer to us than we may think, And a final blessing on the next slide, please, Chris, from Father Mininger. May you be happy. May you be free. May you be loving. May you be loved. This was in the emails he sent me in 2020, and it's my prayer for you and for us all. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to turn it over to you, Mark, and everybody.
Carmen, thank you so much for that wealth of information and your more than just knowledge about it, just your immersion into these texts and then sharing them with us. Wonderful. We want to open it up now and invite all of you to ask a question or make a comment that Carmen then can respond to or react to. So one way, it's kind of our preferred way if you're able to do it, is to raise a virtual hand, because that also kind of puts you up at the top of the list and we can see you more easily. But if that's too tricky for you or it's not happening right now, then you can also wave a real live hand, and it might take us a minute or two to find you on the screen, but we will. And then we can unmute you and you can ask or make a comment to Carmen directly. One third option is we will open up the chat now. And I realized when we had the chat open before, it wasn't actually open to everyone. So now it will be. But you could chat a question or a comment as well. And then Chris will help call those out, and Carmen can respond to those as well. We also, just a little reminder for all of us that we're a fairly large group here, and so try to be direct with a question or comment and have a kind of economy of words if you're able. So let's open it up and let's see. And as Carmen said earlier, when we were getting ready in our little team meeting, she said this is the real juicy part for her. So have at it.
You never know. You never know. Can I say I just saw one in the chat, Mark, from Victoria? Sure. Why do we think the cloud was written anonymously is a really good question. The short answer is we don't quite know, but that's a really good question, and it's one I've wondered about. I think part of it is that he was genuinely humble and genuinely wanted to stay anonymous and have the emphasis on his work. So like, I must decrease and Christ must increase, that sort of idea of true humility. I also think that, this is the 14th century, right? And there has always been a little bit of a movement in the greater church that this direct access to God is a little bit edgy. And so being anonymous was also a little bit handy, because this also happened with Brother Lawrence. He had powerful friends. He was not powerful, but he had people who loved him in high places, who kind of protected him from the quietism of his day, which was a similar sort of pushback against direct access, to God, which, but that's a really good question. But I do think part of it was, because it would be really hard to translate people who weren't genuine. I would have a really hard time because of the intimacy involved. Jhumpa Lahiri says that translating is the most intimate form of reading, and I totally agree. I think that Cloud's Anonymous is very genuine, and I think part of it was he did want to stay anonymous, but also, there was the other. I often wonder if Brother Lawrence would be a bit horrified because he really did live an intentionally hidden life, but we'll see. We won't be able to, on this plane, won't be able to ask him what he thinks about his new translation.
Thanks, Carmen. Thanks, Victoria, for the question. Let's go to Lydia, see if we can get you. Oh, you are unmuted.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that very informative and very interesting presentation. Is there any possibility that the cloud being in the 14th century and Brother Lawrence, the 17th century, that somehow there was some sort of stream or connection between the contemplatives in England and the contemplatives in Europe, or I mean, or in the continent, or France.
This is such a good question. And I'll be totally transparent. I asked that question myself. There were connections between the two streams, because the more you start digging in contemplation, the more you see connections everywhere. But I actually will just admit that I emailed Bernard McGinn and asked him this question. So he said no, but that there would not have been. But I think that really the idea that Brother Lawrence listened to Teresa of Avila and also Juan de la Cruz, that there was a lot of Dennis there. And so I do think Dennis is sort of the common thread here, or Dionysius the Areopagite. But you're like me, I actually had this image in my mind, because the other thing is, Dr. McGinn said, he wouldn't really have been able to read it in the, what I'm saying? There's also that thing of like, he was doing French. And so, it would have been in English. So he wouldn't have been able, because he was uneducated. But I did have this kind of like moment, like Steve Allen, that old TV show. I did have this moment of like, could he have read The Cloud? Because there's so many resonances, but it's more that they're in the same lineage. But it's a really good question. And if you're like me, I wish it were true, or that they could have met somehow. That's a great question, Lydia.
Thanks, Lydia. Let's go to the chat again from Rex. Carmen, what is the relationship between love and unknowing?
So that's a really good question. I've thought a lot about that. Wow. Thank you for that. Brilliant and wise question. It reminds me of the professor at Emory, I think she's emerita now, who talks about, the stages of love, really. So like, I remember when I started dating the man who's now my husband, and I knew it was serious when we went to this Swiss restaurant. Oh, and it's Roberta Bondi is who I was talking about at Emory. She talks about this aspect, this question of unknowing and love. We went to the Swiss restaurant and we were eating fries, very mundane. And this was in London when I was a student there. And all of a sudden, we both realized we had not been talking. We were so comfortable with each other, we had not been talking. And so I remember Sean said, wow, we haven't been talking. And I was like, uh-oh, this is serious. Because, I'd already thought I was falling in love, but then not talking is serious, like we were so comfortable in each other's company. And then Roberta Bondi talks about a lot how you have this stage where when you're talking with someone, like when I teach, I'm very intentional about how I try to present things and listen to students actively. And there's much metacognition of it. And then there's my mother and I when we talk. So, I'm trying to get to know my students, right? Then when my mother and I talk, sometimes we can finish each other's sentences. So there's a different level of intimacy there. And sometimes my mother will say, if I call her and she's busy, she'll say, I knew I didn't have to answer or let you know I was busy, that we'd connect later. So there's a silence that is a trust and an understanding. And then Roberta Bondi says, and then there is the silence of lovemaking. So, there's this intimacy that is without words, that is a connection, an embodied kind of connection. So the other thing is both The Cloud of Unknowing and Brother Lawrence talk about how Brother Lawrence even says it. He says, overthinking complicates everything. Now, I think we're given a mind for a reason. I'm grateful for the mind. But I spent, decades trying to live up to our Western school binary of making A's and thinking well and passing tests. And that only really takes you so far. For example, if I can tell you all the things I know about my husband, that's only on paper. I'd have to tell you also there are things I don't know about him. And then there's aspects of him that I unknow, to let him be and to listen. So part of the thing I think about love and unknowing is that in order to listen actively, I have to be willing to let go of what I know. Because if I'm full of what I know, I'm not listening to what is actually present. And so for me, love and unknowing is really hard to explain and better to practice and to experience it. But there is definitely a connection. I think we suffer from a society, a sort of our stress in the West, especially, is on hyper rationalization, which is unknowing is a healthy part of listening, to me anyway.
Oh, beautiful. Thanks, Carmen. And thanks,
That's a good
Rex.
question.
Yeah, for that question. Let's get Michelle has a question. She's got her hand up. Let's see if we can get her unmuted and on the screen here.
Hi, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. Really went to my heart. And I just have a quick question when you presented the basics, 321 in that chapter 35, about Lectio Divina. And the fourth step was kind of missing for me, the contemplatio, that contemplative. And I just wondered why that was, or is that rolled into the praying part where the total letting go? And
that's a good question, because when we talk about it in the steps and everything, it gets really kind of tricky, doesn't it? Because really and truly, it's so recursive. But yes, the fourth, so we have contemplatio, number 4, Michelle, like you're saying, is definitely like the contemplative prayer itself. So from my experience, because I used to walk around the University of Georgia with like Bible verses, like, come unto me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest, take my yoke upon you. And I would have these typed up and printed out on little 3 or 5 or 4 by 6 cards. And so I'd walk around with these. So that's the reading, right? So that's the Lectio, is the reading, right? And then the next step, when we enter into sort of reflecting on it, like, what does this mean to me? Or what aspect of this? So for me, what always jumped out, I would always ask myself, what is jumping out in this to me? And it would be rest, because I could not rest then. I mean, I was even having insomnia, like, maybe 2 hours of sleep a night or so. And what is it that, like, I would really sit with all of those words. And then there comes a point along that path of 1, 2, 3. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it is helpful, I think, to have the Lectio, Meditatio, Oratio. It's kind of helpful to have that, but at the same time, it's not helpful in a way, because they all sort of start mixing together. So you read, you reflect on the rest, and then you enter this sort of prayerful space of, like, help me learn to rest. So it's like the third step corresponds to Teresa of Avila's mental prayer. So the third step is, please help me learn to rest. I mean, I carried around a little stone that had the word rest on it for a very long time in my pocket. Please help me learn to rest. Or things like, what am I supposed to do with this? How can I rest? And then at some point, the wordlessness comes, and that's the oratio, right? And so and then during the oratio, sometimes I'd look back at the card and I'd be back in Lectio. What I was saying about the 3 steps of the Lectio, Meditatio, and the oratio is that the Cloud of Unknowings Anonymous assumes that people are feeding their minds with this kind of rumination on scripture, on sacred readings by, like, say, commentary by Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross or Mary Oliver today, in so many ways. And Guigo talks about this a lot. It's one reason I think that Brother Lawrence is often called the methodless method, and so is contemplative prayer, in like centering prayer and stuff, because it really enters the stage where you can't count the steps. You enter this sort of stage where it all starts being organic and mushing together. The reason that I delineated it as those 3 things is because often I think we all want to kind of forget that there's a feeding of the mind and the soul that these two people did, Brother Lawrence and also Anonymous. They were always in the scripture. They were always doing this kind of reflection on sacred words. And they were also doing this kind of mental prayer too. Of course, Brother Lawrence says he eventually sort of superseded it and only did this practice of the presence. But yeah, I know it gets kind of complicated in a way, but the main point I was trying to make with those three things of Lectio, Meditatio, and Oratio is that we could, I suppose, just jump in and do like meditation, but that it really helps to feed the soul with this. And both of these gentlemen, these teachers, grounded their contemplation in sacred scriptures and readings like commentary and such. Does that kind of answer your question? Because you asked a pretty complex question.
Well, no, thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The thing is, though, if it makes your head hurt, Michelle, because it does mine sometimes, the thing is, the steps are very much like okay, so, we have grammar and we have language, which is living. So we have grammar and all grammars leak, and we put a grammar onto a language. We have constellations, which is the order we put onto the stars. When we have the 4 steps of like Lectio, Meditatio, Oratio, and Contemplatio, that is us putting steps onto prayer. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like an artificial thing, just trying to help us see it a bit better. So if some of it helps you and some of it doesn't, then it used to hurt my head. Now I'm not so afraid of it anymore, the way we talk about it. But yeah, I hope that helps in some way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Carmen, there's a few comments in the chat box. Just read comments, maybe if you want to comment
I
on
haven't
them
kept up
or
with the
not.
chat. Let me look.
Yeah, from Rachel in Los Angeles, says, I found this
Yes.
presentation super encouraging in my own practice of contemplative living. Thank you. I would say ditto to that. And then Thomas says, I've been helped by the whole idea of a spirituality of imperfection. Reading Simon Tugwell's Ways of Imperfection has been a positive encouragement.
Can we talk about that? Who was
Sure,
that? Who
yeah,
said
yeah.
that? Who was that?
Thomas.
Okay, so Thomas, I'm with you on that. So one of the things I like to say I'm a recovering perfectionist. The reason I like to admit that is because I have students who got to UC Berkeley because they tell me, they say, I'm a perfectionist. They tell me they are. And one of the things that I hit my head up against the wall of in religious texts growing up was it would say, be perfect. And I'm like, oh my God, that was what I heard in church growing up. And, it's like I almost had like a policeman in my mind who was telling me where I was doing things wrong and that I was bad. And so perfectionism was like this. You're either right and doing spirituality or religion or love right, or you're doing it totally wrong. And all I knew as a child was I had a lot of X's in my mind. Then you run into Brother Lawrence. And one of the things I discovered is that he's not at all binary. He doesn't even use the word sin and sinner that much at all. He uses it once. And even then in French, the word for sinner is based in this word for I stumble. I mean, and think about it. This a man who limped writing about stumbling. So it's about causing harm. So when I read in, is it James or wherever it is in the Bible, and when I read in commentaries like in Aquinas and such, the smart commentators always talk about how this being perfect in love is about maturity and wholeness. It's not at all about flawlessness. It's not at all about not making mistakes. That's that binary, what Anne Lamott calls perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor. It's that very much binary mindset of I'm either right or wrong. And usually it doesn't mean I'm either right or wrong in my behavior. It means I'm either inherently right or wrong, which is devastating, right? From a psychological and soul and body perspective. So I look at the word perfect I look at its etymology. The per part means thoroughly and to do again. And the fect part is one of the most common verbs in the French language, and it means to do. And it's similar to expert. You know, I used to always say everyone needs on their expert committee someone like my mother who has common sense, which is apparently not common. And expert means, again, the pert part, it means to experience thoroughly. So to perfect, I don't really think of perfect so much, although perfect as a noun means whole. It means mature and whole in these religious contexts. But I prefer the verb perfect. And in perfect, you're not trying to do it without mistakes. You're just doing it again. I love this notion of imperfection. And I know this is Teresa of Lisieux. I mean, I think yesterday was her special day. And she has this theology of imperfection. I think it's funny that we even, not funny, but like kind of tragic that we even have to talk about this, because one of the things that has helped me so much is this sort of identifying self-compassion as I'm part of the human race, and how silly of me to ever think I could have been perfect. What does that have to do with being human? You know, kind. I would really like to be kind. I would really like to learn from the ways that I have harmed myself and others and ask for forgiveness, atone, and not do it again. Yes. But perfection doesn't, as in flawlessness and not making mistakes. You know, it's one of the hardest tasks I have as a teacher is asking students to please risk not doing it right, so to speak, to risk doing it until they get a sense of what they're trying to do, to risk failing. Like, yeah. So I love that. That's one of my favorite things. And I really worked into I will say this, I worked into the translation of Brother Lawrence. Every time he does use the word perfect, I include love or wholeness or this notion of maturity, kind of as an extra padding so that people aren't pulled into this stress really of perfectionism, which is really stressful, I think.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Thomas, for that comment. And Carmen, I just love that, what you're saying about and highlighting and breaking open just that word alone. Perfect. It's and to do again, to come back again, not like do, but experience again just sounds like the invitation of returning, as Thomas used to say, ever so gently to
Yeah.
the sacred word. You know, we just come back, we come back, we come back, is that kind of perfection.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like
Yeah.
gently, not like you haven't gotten it right yet, but like you're enjoying to do it. Like it's just, it's really helped me a lot too, to be gentler in thinking about these things. I
Yeah,
like
to
that
have
you,
1,000 opportunities to
Yeah.
come back, as Thomas said, that my mind goes off 1,000 times is a great opportunity to do again.
I love too, because does anybody ever sit down and just not have thoughts drop in and need to let go of them? I don't. So, I mean, sometimes students look at me and go, you have to revise your writing too. I'm like, writing is revising. I mean, meditating is having thoughts drop in. It is what it is, right?
Yeah.
I'm grateful for community, because it really does help you know you're not alone in this.
Yeah. Let's get Bill on screen here. He's got his hand up
Bill.
for a question or comment. Oh, let's get you unmuted. We got to get you unmuted, Bill. Hold on one sec here.
Now I'm there.
There you are. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Just repeat where you started. Thanks.
Oh, I just want to amen, Mark, what you just said. Be ye perfect. Do again. Carmen, I love it. And as you know, I need it. Carmen, thank you for your presentation. My heart is stirred. My heart is stirred. Wow. I have one comment and one question. Comment. I started centering prayer, 20 years ago, and I knew that I needed rest. I'm a doer and I need rest. and I found rest. I didn't know that was going to be rest in God, but what surprised me was what Mary Oliver said when you started out. It's the interconnectedness. Wow. I'm a loner. And I learned, no, that's not it, Bill. Okay, that's my comment. The interconnectedness was a surprise. And here's my question. Do you have any comment about the loneliness of the journey? I have one person in our church that I can talk to, who knows about the journey, and maybe one family member, and I have a very large family. And my heart just wants to share it, of course, with everyone. And if I speak up at my church, I'm labeled a heretic. I think you know what I'm talking about. Any comments on that part of the lonely journey?
Well, I'm glad you I thank you for sharing that, Bill, because I think that that's something really worth really looking at. I will admit too, to address your comment before your question, that I'm an introvert with an extrovert interface. So I understand about recharging and needing alone time. I think that's very healthy for me. And about the loneliness of the journey. James Finley said something really profound to me this summer. And he says it a lot to different people, but just hearing him say it meant a lot to me. He said, that Thomas Merton said to him that on occasion, you will find somebody who really gets your spiritual journey. They'll see what you're, they'll get it. And that it's a rare thing though, kind of this, that kind of total thing. But at the same time, he said, because he counsels people to this day, people who are trauma survivors, who are trying to bring their spirituality into their healing. So he is doing that kind of therapy. And then there's also, spiritual direction and spiritual companions. I think that there is, as Sharon Salzberg says, some things just hurt. I think there's also just the idea that we all are in some ways separate, but I do think that there is companionship available if I can open up. I know that for me anyway, sometimes it is just gently sort of finding ways to open up. And I'll just tell you a personal story. When I translated The Cloud of Unknowing, it was it really helped me to deal with this is not why I did it, but this is what happened. And I didn't know this at the time, but I knew something big was going on. And I was dealing with the shadow in myself and a lot of healing that I needed. And there was just something about the experience was sort of 24/7 intense contemplation for months. And at the end of it, and I mean, when I translate, it's not unusual to translate 10 hours a day because then you can kind of get up into the thermals. And it doesn't mean I do it strenuously, but having some continuity is helpful for looking things up and reading history books and just looking in dictionaries. And when I was done, I knew I needed to see someone, but it was really hard. I went to therapy not long after the book was published. And it's not really quite what you're asking, I don't think, Bill. But I do think that my loneliness of journey at that point needed someone to come alongside me. And I do think that it's one reason that I value and I like coming into like Contemplative Outreach International. I think there is community here in different ways where we realize we're not alone. And I think we really need these gentle, these gentle moments of not even, because like therapy can be pretty intense sometimes, right? And hard work in addition to other things. But in these moments in our gatherings that are kind of gentle, like here today, I think we hear people say things, we see their faces, we contemplate together. And I think that there's a lot of strength in that. And then I also try to find it where I can get it, like even if it's a moment with a egret, or if it's a moment with a friend who doesn't, maybe we don't even have the same sort of approach to life. Maybe they're stoic, maybe they're atheist, maybe they're whatever. So I think, but I do hear what you're saying underneath it all. I do think there is an aspect of it. I do think that it might be a gift when we feel loneliness, in the sense of, then I realize I am interconnected. That loneliness reminds me, oh, I need friends. That's what it does for me. I need to befriend myself. Sometimes my loneliness is because I need to be gentler with myself, like, like be my own best friend. And sometimes it's just remembering that I have friends and reaching out and just being gentler. I just think overall, it reminds me to be gentler with myself, because sometimes loneliness is also, for me anyway, I'm tired. I'm really tired. I mean, sometimes you work hard and you're just like, oh, I've seen students all day, and you just feel kind of alone, and you're like, you need to rest, girl. So, it can be, I think it's a great question. I don't know that I have touched on an answer to it, but it's really worth asking, I think.
Thank you, sister.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And yeah, relatable, very relatable question.
Yeah.
Carmen, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and we have a few more questions in the chat box, and some are comments. So maybe we'll see if we can scroll through here. Julie in Michigan wants to say thank you, Carmen, for your joyful presence. And then also mentions that God as they, in quotes, capital THEY, they, God as they has been such a gift to me. I don't know if you want to say more about the they of God.
Oh, I'm happy to bring that up. I mean, I'm happy you brought that up, and I'm happy to comment on that. Thank you so much. Because so how that came about in a nutshell is that when I was young and as I was growing up, God was only He. And, I identify as a woman, and also I've had some childhood trauma where, just like Roberta Bondi, I love her because she said she had difficulties with her father, and God as Father was difficult for her. And I don't think we talk enough about this, how sometimes people have difficulty relating to the divinity for certain reasons, in their background, for trauma or different reasons. But I mean, I tried, and then I ran into graduate school. I ran into the women like Juliana Norwich, who talk about God as she, and my mom's a really kind person. And so that kind of worked for a while, but it never quite felt, it more felt like God is He and God is she, and God is not He and God is not she. And I was just kind of trying to figure what made my heart feel okay. Well, so when you read Brother Lawrence, he does have he in the text, because I mean, he's from the 1600s and that's the way it was and everything, but he has a lived Trinitarian theology. So for him, the Trinity wasn't just like this intellectual concept, but it was like God the parent, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And if you read the book, it's hard to explain in 1 minute, but he lived out this Trinitarian understanding of God, that God is relationship, that each person is an individual and unique, and we make space for each other's differences, that are the way we're, just to listen to each other and to respect each other and all that kind of stuff. He saw all that and experienced it in the Trinity. So when I finished translating the rough draft of it, my editor and I met. I hadn't told her I was translating it because I wasn't sure. I'd only read Brother Lawrence in translation. I wasn't sure if his theology would be healthy enough for me to have that sort of communing experience with. So I spent about 3 or 4 months doing a draft version, and then I'd revise it for about 1.5 years because, nothing happens fast in translation. But anyway, I met with my friend Lil Copan, who's my editor, and I said, at the end, I've done it, I've translated it. And then she goes, well, you'll not have to do a proposal. And I'm like, you mean you just won't take it? Oh my gosh. Oh, proposals are the bane of your existence. You're like, you've got to convince somebody to publish it now. Now that you've gotten hooked into it and you love it, now you've got to convince somebody to publish it. And I said, but Lil, the only thing is I could not translate it without he. And she just said, oh, well, So I even tried at first translating it without any pronouns, which doesn't work in English. But But I was trying to find a way not only to translate where I felt comfortable, but where it represented his Trinitarian theology that's lived and embodied, but also where my students, because I've started translating for my students and younger, but where my students who identify as women or as trans or whatever, where they felt comfortable entering the text. But I thought, well, I can't do it. You know, there are just only some things you can, because I wanted the translation to be accurate and faithful and to translate everything. So mine's the first one to translate everything, because in the past, some things have been left out. And I worked so hard for it to be accurate and faithful. Then I got up the next morning after my conversation with Lil at like about 4:30. This is like August. It's the pandemic. There are no cars on the road. There's a shutdown. One of my dearest friends, you know, I mean, there was death happening all over the world, and I knew people who were dying. And so, you know, that really does impact you. I got up and there were birds chirping and there were no cars on the road, and there was they. That's all I can say. They was waiting for me that morning after talking with Lil. And I thought, they, oh my, I never thought about that. I never had thought about that. But, you know, of course, I have students who identify with the pronouns they. And I thought immediately, I didn't even have to think, because it wasn't from my brain. It was from like my gut, as Cynthia Bourgeau might say. It was from my heart, my mind, my soul, my gut, my body. And I thought, yes. As soon as I heard it, I was like, I'm here, Spirit, just show me how to do it. Because the thing is, you don't just do a global search and replace with pronouns, because I wanted it to work. I wanted to also, eventually I saw I could maybe use it to teach us all how we might use they pronouns with people who prefer, our friends, our family members who prefer they, because it does take some practice. But also there are places in the text where Brother Lawrence talks about how sometimes God will allow you to suffer until he's ready for you to have some relief. And what he means by that is it's very mysterious suffering. I mean, he suffered every day, so he's not Pollyanna-ish. But there were times when I didn't want to use they, because it would be a bit in a negative context, or could be possibly taken in a negative context. So it was a very prayerful revision, and it took me months. I'm happy to admit that the they came from the Spirit, and it has surprised me how people have been the responses have been very positive. I've had people almost tell me weeping how much it means to them. I've had people tell me, I wasn't sure about that at first. And then as I read along, I was like, oh my goodness, this really opens up some things for me. So I'm not saying it's how all text should be. I'm just saying this is what happened. And I'm grateful that it does make me feel more comfortable, because it opens up some mystery. And so I appreciate that you say that. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, too, for exerting yourself in that delicate process of translation and looking at that to be more inclusive, but also to with regard to, you know, referring to God, that communal relational element that comes through in the using the they of God. And sorry to say that the day of this community this time together is coming to a close. There are more comments and more questions that we won't be able to get to, but I will say this about that we happily have invited Carmen to be one of our guests on the inaugural season of the Contemplative Outreach International podcast that will be starting this November. And what I promised to do is capture some of these other comments and questions that we didn't get to and try to insert them into our conversation on the podcast that will be happening soon. So thank you all for those comments and questions and additional really gifts in our coming together here of all the comments. I just want to quickly say that Carmen's books are available online on all the online bookstores and on her website, which is carmenbutcher.com. that will also give you access to her blog and the many, many media appearances that Carmen has been doing. She's, you can find her on Facebook and on YouTube. Also, we want to invite you to go to the Contemplative Outreach website as well. It's contemplativeoutreach.org. There's a lot of resources there. This workshop has been recorded and it will be made available in about 2 weeks or so. There was one question about getting Carmen's slides. They'll be represented in the video of this entire workshop. So look for that recording that's coming out in a couple of weeks. And once again, Carmen, I just want to say thank you for being here and sharing your deep knowledge and also just your person. I also want to, once again, thank Chris Thompson for quietly being behind the scenes and helping us flow through this.